12 years old, standing alone in a forest, miles from anywhere, holding a wire in his hands that controlled a steam-powered machine he couldn't see. The wire ran through the woods, looped over trees, stretched across ravines, connecting him to a donkey puncher operating a steam donkey a quarter-mile away. The wire was his only communication. When the rigging crew, men working in the forest setting chokers on logs, needed the donkey to pull or stop, they'd signal the boy. The boy would pull the wire. The wire would trigger a steam whistle on the donkey. 1 pull meant stop. 2 meant go slow. 3 meant go fast. A continuous pull meant emergency. Someone's hurt. Someone's trapped. Shut down now. The boy's job was simple in description. Watch for signals from men he could barely see. Pull the wire correctly. Do not make a mistake. Because a mistake meant the cable would pull when it should stop, or stop when it should pull, and men would die, crushed between logs or caught by snapping cables. And when the accident happened, the boy would be blamed. 12 years old. This was a whistle punk. And the companies preferred orphans. Children with no parents, no family, no one to ask questions when the child was injured or killed. Children who cost 50 cents a day instead of the $2.50 a man would demand. Children who were expendable. Between roughly 1890 and 1930, thousands of boys, some as young as 8, worked as whistle punks in the logging operations of the Pacific Northwest, the Upper Midwest, and the South. They were the invisible labor, the forgotten children, who operated the communication systems that made steam donkey logging possible. And they died. Crushed, decapitated, frozen, lost, killed in accidents that were predictable and preventable, but accepted because a dead child cost the company less than hiring a man. This is the story of the whistle punks. Who they were, what they did, why they were children, and why so many of them were orphans. Let's start with the job itself, because understanding what a whistle punk did explains why it was given to children and why it was so dangerous. Steam donkey logging, which we've discussed elsewhere, used a portable steam engine with a drum and cable to drag logs out of the forest. The donkey was stationary, positioned at a central location called the landing. The cable ran out from the donkey into the woods, sometimes a quarter-mile or more. The rigging crew, the men working in the forest, would attach the cable to logs using chokers, loops of smaller cable. When a log was ready to be moved, the crew would signal the donkey puncher, the operator, to pull. The donkey would wind in the cable, dragging the log through the forest to the landing. The problem was communication. The donkey puncher couldn't see the rigging crew. They were too far away, hidden by trees and terrain. And the noise of the steam engine, the hiss and clank and roar, meant he couldn't hear them shouting. So a signal system was needed. The solution was the whistle punk and the signal wire. A wire, usually a lightweight steel cable or a heavy cord, was strung from the donkey through the forest to the rigging crew's location. The wire ran through small pulleys or loops attached to trees, allowing it to move freely. One end of the wire was attached to the steam whistle on the donkey. When the wire was pulled, it opened the whistle valve, and the whistle blew. The rigging crew couldn't pull the wire directly because they were too far away, and the wire was too long. So the whistle punk was positioned partway between the donkey and the crew, at a point where he could see the crew's hand signals and could pull the wire to operate the whistle. The whistle punk's job was to watch the rigging crew constantly, interpret their hand signals, and pull the wire the correct number of times. 1 pull, stop. 2 pulls, go ahead slow. 3 pulls, go ahead fast. A long, continuous pull, emergency. The donkey puncher, hearing the whistle, would respond, controlling the donkey based on the signal. The system worked, but it required the whistle punk to be absolutely attentive, absolutely accurate, and absolutely alone. He stood or sat in one spot in the forest for 10, 12, 14 hours a day, eyes on the rigging crew, hand on the wire. He couldn't leave his position. He couldn't wander off. If he missed a signal or gave the wrong signal, men could die. Why were children used for this job? The companies had reasons, economic and practical, that they would defend publicly and that internal documents reveal were cynical calculations. The public reason was that boys were more attentive than men. Children, the companies claimed, could focus on a simple, repetitive task without getting distracted or bored. They were quick, alert, and their small size made them ideal for positioning in tight spots in the forest. This was the story told to inspectors and reformers. The private reality, documented in company correspondence and hiring records, was different. Children were cheap. A boy could be hired for 50 cents to $1 a day. A man doing the same job would demand $2.50 to $4. Over a season, the savings were significant. A logging operation with 5 or 6 whistlepunks could save hundreds of dollars by using boys instead of men. Children were expendable. If a boy was injured or killed, the company's liability was minimal. There was no workers' compensation for children in most states until the 1910s. The families, if the child had family, had little legal recourse. And if the child was an orphan, there was no family to complain or sue. The risk was transferred entirely to the child. Children's size was an advantage in certain situations. A small boy could fit into spaces between logs, could crawl under machinery, could position himself in places an adult couldn't. This wasn't for the child's benefit. It was because the companies designed operations that required someone small to reach into dangerous spaces. And using a child meant you didn't have to redesign the operation to be safer. And children were compliant. A boy, especially an orphan or an indentured child, had no power, no voice, no ability to refuse dangerous work. A man could quit, could complain, could organize with other workers. A child did what he was told, or was beaten or fired and left with nothing. So who were these children? Where did they come from? The logging companies recruited from specific sources, targeting the most vulnerable populations. Orphanages and poorhouses were a primary source. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, institutions housing orphaned, abandoned, or destitute children were overwhelmed and underfunded. The institutions practiced placing out, sending children to live and work with families or businesses under contracts that were essentially indenture. The child would work, unpaid or minimally paid, until they reached 18 or 21. In theory, the child was supposed to receive training, education, and care. In practice, many were sent to labor camps, including logging operations, where they worked in dangerous conditions with no oversight. The institutions benefited financially. Logging companies would pay the institution a fee for each child, $20 to $50, and the institution reduced its costs by having fewer mouths to feed. The children had no say. They were told they were going to learn a trade, to have an opportunity, and they were put on a train or a wagon and sent to a logging camp hundreds of miles from anywhere they knew. Runaways were another source. Boys fleeing abusive homes, fleeing other labor situations, fleeing poverty. They'd show up at logging camps looking for work, any work, and they'd be hired with no questions asked. No paperwork, no verification of age, no background. If a boy said he was 14, he was 14, even if he was obviously 10 or 11. The companies didn't care. They wanted labor, and a desperate runaway was ideal because he had no connections, no one looking for him, no leverage. Immigrant children were targeted as well. Families arriving in the United States, desperate for income, not speaking English, vulnerable to exploitation. Labor agents would approach them, promise good wages and training for their children, and the parents, trusting or deceived, would hand over their sons. The children would be sent to camps, and the parents would receive a small payment, sometimes nothing, and would lose track of their children. Some families never saw their sons again. The daily reality of a whistle punk's life was a combination of boredom, fear, and exhaustion. A typical day began before dawn. The camp would wake at 4:30 or 5. The boy would eat if there was food available, often there wasn't much, and he'd walk with the crew to the rigging site. The walk could be a mile or two through dark forest, and the boy, smaller and younger, would struggle to keep up. At the rigging site, the boy would be positioned. The rigging boss, or the donkey puncher, would show him where to stand or sit, would point out the crew he needed to watch, would remind him of the signals. Then the work would start, and the boy would be alone. The workday was 10 to 14 hours, depending on the operation and the season. The boy stood or sat in one spot, eyes on the crew, hand on the wire. He couldn't sit down if he was supposed to stand, couldn't move from his spot, couldn't relax. The crew was working, moving logs, and signals could come at any time. If he missed a signal, if he was looking away or distracted for even a few seconds, the result could be disaster. The isolation was profound. The boy was alone in the forest. He couldn't see the donkey, couldn't see most of the crew except the one or two men whose signals he watched. He couldn't talk to anyone. The noise of the operation, the crash of logs, the hiss of the donkey, the shouts of the crew, all of it was distant. He was a solitary figure in the woods, responsible for communicating, but unable to communicate himself. The weather was unrelenting. In the Pacific Northwest, it rained. The boy stood in the rain for hours, soaked through, cold, with no shelter. In winter it was colder, sometimes below freezing, and the boy had inadequate clothing, often just whatever had been handed down from older workers, too large, worn out. In summer, the heat and the bugs were constant. Mosquitoes, flies, no relief. The fear was constant. The boy knew that mistakes meant death. He'd seen it or heard about it. A wrong signal, a cable pulled when it should have stopped, and a man was crushed. Or the cable snapped and whipped through the forest, and anyone in its path was killed. And the whistle punk, positioned between the donkey and the crew, was often in the cable's path. If the cable snapped, the boy died first. And the boy knew this. He lived with this knowledge every moment of every day. He also knew that if an accident happened, he would be blamed. Even if the equipment failed, even if the donkey puncher misunderstood the signal, the boy was the easiest scapegoat. He'd be beaten, fired, sent away. And if he was an orphan, there was no one to defend him. The boredom was paradoxical. Hours of watching, waiting for signals that came irregularly. Long stretches where nothing happened, where the boy just stood and watched and tried not to let his attention wander. And then sudden action, a flurry of signals, the need to respond quickly and correctly. The combination of boredom and high stakes was psychologically exhausting. By evening, when the work stopped and the crew walked back to camp, the boy was drained. Physically tired from standing all day, mentally exhausted from the constant vigilance and fear. And then dinner, if there was any left. The whistle punks ate last in many camps, after the men, and often the food was gone or reduced to scraps. And then sleep, in a bunkhouse with adult men, with no privacy, no safety, no protection. The dangers the whistle punks faced were varied and often lethal. The cables were the most immediate threat. A steel cable under tension, pulling a 40-ton log through the forest, holds enormous energy. If the cable snaps, it whips. The cable doesn't fall. It becomes a projectile, moving faster than the eye can see, cutting through anything in its path. The whistle punk's position, between the donkey and the crew, often put him directly in the cable's potential whip path. If the cable snapped while under load, the boy had no warning, no time to react. In 1907, in a logging operation near Aberdeen, Washington, a cable snapped during a pull. The whistle punk, a boy named Thomas, age 11, was positioned about 50 feet from where the cable failed. The cable whipped back, struck the boy across the neck, and decapitated him. The crew found his body moments later. The company's response, documented in the camp log, was to note the accident, assign a new whistle punk, and resume operations the next day. Thomas's body was buried in a clearing near the camp. No marker, no notification to any family, because he was an orphan, placed by an institution in Portland, and the institution had no record of where he'd been sent. Runaway logs were another hazard. Logs being skidded, dragged by the cable, sometimes broke free or rolled when they hit obstacles. A log rolling downhill, gaining momentum, was unstoppable. The whistle punk, standing in the forest, might be directly in the path. In 1912, a boy named Peter, age 10, was killed when a log broke free from the cable and rolled. The log, estimated at 3 tons, crushed the boy against a tree. He died instantly. The crew recovered his body and informed the camp boss. The boy was an immigrant, Polish, and his family was back east somewhere. No one knew how to contact them, and no effort was made. Weather and exposure killed boys as well. Hypothermia in the winter, standing for hours in wet clothes and freezing temperatures. A boy named Andrew, age 9, was found dead at his position in January of 1910 in northern Minnesota. He had frozen to death during the workday. The crew assumed he'd sat down to rest and hadn't gotten up. His body was stiff when they found him. He'd been placed by an orphanage in Duluth under an indenture contract. The orphanage was notified, and they noted his death in their records with no further action. Heat exhaustion and dehydration in the summer were equally dangerous. Boys working all day in the sun with no water, no shade, would collapse. Some recovered, some didn't. Animal attacks were rare but documented. Bears and cougars were present in the forests where logging occurred. A boy, alone, small, vulnerable, was potential prey. There are accounts, though specifics are sparse, of boys being attacked. One account from a camp in Oregon describes a boy who disappeared. The crew searched and found evidence of a cougar attack, blood and torn clothing, but no body. The boy's name isn't recorded. He was listed in the camp records as Boy, Whistle Punk, Lost. Machinery accidents killed whistle punks when they were assigned tasks beyond signaling. Some camps used the boys for other work during downtime, cleaning equipment, oiling machinery, tasks that put them in contact with moving parts. A boy named James, age 9, was killed in 1913 when he was pulled into the drum mechanism of a steam donkey while oiling a bearing. The machinery crushed him. The donkey puncher shut down the engine, and the crew extracted what remained of the boy's body. The company listed the cause of death as carelessness and fined the boy's indenture account for the time lost cleaning the machinery. Camp life for whistle punks was often brutal beyond the work itself. They lived in the bunkhouses with the adult men, sleeping in the same crowded, lice-infested conditions we've described elsewhere. But the boys had additional vulnerabilities. They were smaller, weaker, and they had no protectors. Physical abuse was common. Boys were beaten for mistakes, for perceived laziness, for being in the way. The camp boss, the foreman, even other workers would hit the boys with fists, with tools, with whatever was at hand. The boys had no recourse. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't complain. If they ran away, they'd likely die in the wilderness or be caught and returned and beaten worse. Sexual abuse was documented in testimonies and investigations, though the records are sparse because the topic was taboo and the victims were powerless. Boys living with adult men in isolated camps, with no oversight, no protection, were vulnerable. Some men acted as protectors, but many did not, and the institutional indifference meant that abuse was tolerated or ignored. Food was another area of deprivation. The whistle punks ate last, after the men. By the time the boys got to the cookhouse, the food was often gone, or reduced to the least desirable scraps. The boys were growing, doing physical work in harsh conditions, and they were chronically underfed. Malnutrition was common, contributing to illness and injury. Clothing was inadequate and handed down. A boy would arrive at camp with whatever he'd been wearing. The company provided nothing, or provided cast-offs from workers who'd left or died. The clothing was too large, worn out, inadequate for the weather. Boys worked in oversized boots that gave them blisters, in coats that didn't close, in pants held up with rope. The inadequacy of clothing contributed to exposure injuries and deaths. There were occasional acts of kindness, rare but documented. A camp cook who would save extra food for the boys, who would make sure they ate. A donkey puncher who took time to train a whistle punk carefully, who was patient, who didn't blame the boy for every problem. A foreman who intervened to stop a beating. These acts stand out in the testimonies because they were exceptions. The norm was indifference or cruelty. What happened to the whistle punks in the long term, those who survived childhood, is difficult to trace because records are sparse and the boys often had no permanent identity. Many died young, in the camps or shortly after. Death rates are hard to calculate, but estimates based on camp records and investigative reports suggest that 5 to 10% of whistle punks died on the job in high-risk operations. Over a decade, over thousands of boys, that's hundreds of deaths. The injuries were more common than deaths. Boys lost fingers, hands, toes, suffered crushing injuries that left them permanently disabled. A disabled boy was of no use to the company. He'd be sent away, given whatever wages were owed, and left to fend for himself. A 12-year-old with a crushed hand, no family, no skills beyond signaling, had few options. Many ended up begging, some in institutions, some simply disappeared from the record. The boys who survived without major injury often stayed in the logging industry. It was what they knew. They'd age into other jobs, become choker setters, rigging crew, eventually donkey punchers if they learned the skills. But the childhood labor damaged them. Physically, many had chronic injuries, weakened lungs from exposure, damaged hearing from the noise. Psychologically, the trauma was lifelong. Testimonies from men who'd been whistle punks as boys, given decades later to historians or investigators, describe nightmares, anxiety, and inability to trust. A few testimonies survive, given to investigators during the Progressive Era, when child labor was being documented and challenged. One man, interviewed in the 1930s, described being a whistle punk in Washington State in the 1910s. He was 10 years old, placed by an orphanage in Seattle. He worked for 3 years, from age 10 to 13, before an injury, a crushed foot from a rolling log, ended his usefulness. He was sent back to Seattle, dumped at the train station, and he never saw any of the wages he was supposed to have earned. The indenture contract stipulated payment at age 18, but the company claimed he'd broken the contract by being injured. He received nothing. Another testimony, from a man who'd been a whistle punk in Oregon, describes watching a cable snap and kill the boy who'd been his friend, another orphan. The man, giving his testimony, broke down and couldn't continue. The interviewer noted that the man was in his 60s and the event had occurred 50 years earlier, but the trauma was immediate and raw. The end of whistle punk child labor came gradually, driven by Progressive Era reforms, public outcry, and eventually legal change. The early 1900s saw increasing attention to child labor, driven by activists, journalists, and photographers like Louis Hine. Hine, working for the National Child Labor Committee, documented child labor across industries, including logging. His photographs of children in mills, mines, and factories shocked the public. Hine's images of logging camps are fewer because the camps were remote and access was controlled. But the images that exist show boys, clearly children, standing in forests, holding signal wires, looking at the camera with expressions that are haunted. One photograph in particular, a boy of perhaps 10 or 11, standing alone on a hillside, dwarfed by the trees, became iconic in the reform movement. The National Child Labor Committee investigated logging camps, interviewed workers, documented conditions. Their reports detailed the use of children, the dangers, the lack of education, the exploitation. The reports were published, presented to legislatures, used to push for child labor laws. Resistance from the logging industry was fierce. The companies argued that child labor was necessary, that boys were performing essential tasks that men couldn't do as well, that restricting child labor would cripple the industry. They lobbied against child labor laws, fought enforcement, and found loopholes. But public opinion was shifting. The photographs, the testimonies, the documented deaths made it harder to defend the practice. States began passing child labor laws in the 1910s, restricting the employment of children under certain ages in dangerous occupations. Washington state passed a law in 1913 restricting children under 14 from working in logging. Oregon followed. Other states enacted similar laws, though enforcement was weak and the logging industry often ignored the laws in remote operations. The federal government attempted to regulate child labor with the Keating-Owen Act in 1916, which prohibited the interstate commerce of goods produced by child labor. The law was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1918, but the effort continued. By the 1920s, child labor in logging was declining, though it didn't disappear entirely. Technology helped. Mechanical signals, electric systems that replaced the wire and whistle, reduced the need for whistle punks. As logging operations modernized, the job itself became obsolete. The last whistle punks, working in the 1930s and 40s, were generally teenagers, not children, and the job was different, safer, less isolated. What remains today of the whistle punks is fragmentary and fading. There are no memorials, no monuments to the children who died. There are the photographs, the Lewis Hine collection and others, showing boys in logging camps, their faces direct and serious, their eyes older than their years. There are scattered records, company ledgers that list boys, with no names, just ages and wages. There are a few oral histories, testimonies from men who survived and were willing to talk, though most took their stories to the grave. And there is the gap in the historical record, the absence of names, the missing graves, the children who disappeared into the woods and were never accounted for. The total number of whistle punks who died is unknown. The estimates, based on what records exist, suggest hundreds over the peak decades of the practice. But many deaths went unrecorded. A boy who was an orphan, who had no family, whose institution had lost track of him, who died in a remote camp, might be buried in the woods with no marker and no record. He simply disappeared. The legal legacy is the child labor laws, written in part because of the documented horrors of industries like logging. The laws that restrict the employment of children, that mandate education, that prohibit dangerous work, exist because reformers documented what was happening to children like the whistle punks, and the public demanded change. But the laws came too late for the boys who died in the 1890s, the 1900s, the 1910s. They died before anyone in power cared. So here's to the whistle punks, the boys whose names we mostly don't know. Here's to Thomas, age 11, decapitated by a cable in 1907. Here's to Peter, age 10, crushed by a runaway log in 1912. Here's to Andrew, age 9, frozen to death at his post in 1910. Here's to James, age 9, pulled into machinery in 1913. Here's to the boy in Oregon whose name wasn't recorded, killed by a cougar. Here's to the hundreds of others whose deaths were noted in ledgers as boy, accident, or not noted at all. Here's to the boys who survived but were damaged, who carried the trauma for the rest of their lives, who rarely spoke of what they'd endured. They were children. They should have been in school, playing, learning, growing up with the protection and care that children deserve. Instead, they stood alone in forests, operating signal systems for machines that could kill them, working for companies that valued them less than the equipment, treated as expendable because they were orphans or runaways or immigrants, with no power and no voice. They built nothing directly. They didn't fell trees or mill lumber, but the logging operations that extracted billions of board feet of timber depended on them. The system worked because there were boys willing, or forced, to stand in the woods and pull a wire. And when the boys died, the companies replaced them and kept working. The whistlepunks are forgotten now. The term itself is obscure, known mostly to historians and railroad enthusiasts who study logging history. The children behind the term, their suffering and their deaths, are even more obscure. But they deserve to be remembered. Not romanticized, not turned into symbols of frontier hardship, but acknowledged as the victims of an economic system that exploited the most vulnerable and discarded them when they were used up. The forests where they worked have grown back. The camps are gone. The steam donkeys are rusted or scrapped. But the children are still there, in unmarked graves, in forgotten corners of the woods, silent witnesses to an industry that demanded everything from them and gave nothing back.